Playing in spaces, designing for spatial expansion. Let's reconsider play and let's redefine space. The Dutch theorist Huizinga considers play a ritual activity that takes place outside of ordinary life. But what happens if you rethink that and bring play into ordinary life? You can see space as a ritual or a social construct versus just a physical container. And by blurring the boundaries, you can redefine space. And you can blur the boundaries between what is play and what isn't play, what exists in a social context and what doesn't. Let's consider. Play is the struggle between order and chaos, between the will to create and the will to destroy. The main difference between play and playfulness is that while play is an activity, playfulness is an attitude. And you can see that quite clearly in the slide on the right, where a street artist has taken an expectation and made it whimsical and beautiful. Playfulness can glue together an ecology of playthings, situations, behaviors, and people. This is a good example by Andy Goldsworthy, the artist. It is a tree which has been recontextualized as a piece of art in an unexpected environment. Some opportunities you can think about for expansion are the entire world. You can use the entire world as your playground. You can expand through time, and you can also expand through people's social graph. So let's talk about each one of those in turn. Global play has some tools you can deploy to create experiences. You can use virtual or online systems to connect millions of players, and these days you can even leverage existing ones, such as Twitter. You can hide clues around the globe that players have to collect and share online, such as hiding clues in books and bookshops, and then providing riddles for people to find those clues. You can also leverage existing systems such as Reddit or Twitter, as I mentioned earlier, and you can overlay that on physical space. MIT's balloon hunts are a really good example of this. The red balloon hunt that MIT does, where they release a balloon and see how long it takes for people to find this balloon on Twitter using a hashtag, is an experience worth looking at. You can also design for expansion through time. And what I mean by that is specific that you can think about different ways that the play experience can interact with time in different categories. So let's talk about dormant games. The most famous of a dormant game is just basically a regular old Tamagotchi. Players must remain kind of peripheral aware of their Tamagotchi at all points in time. And the Tamagotchi can demand your attention, and you have to stop what you're doing to pay attention to the game. And suddenly you have a very different relationship with this object, and it can change your behavior in the real world. Whereas temporally ambient games are games that are completely ambient. They can happen whenever, wherever, and you kind of control that. There's no pushing or pulling on the player for their time. And like ambient music, you can bring these kinds of experiences in and out of your awareness. The game on the left is called Neko Atsumi, and it is an amazing game about collecting cats. A really beautiful example of a temporal seamless game that was actually played across the entire globe was Jane McGonigal's World Without Oil. And if you don't know your actions are relevant or not in the game, you end up acting like everything is in the game. And games, they always have to respond in a diegetic way to players. And these are a really serious challenge to create. But Jane does a really good job in A World Without Oil of overlaying a fictive world that's run out of oil on top of the player's everyday experience by designing a really compelling set of resources and rules and a social network within the game that enriches that experience. Persistent worlds. These are worlds that exist outside of like any instantiation. A really good example is the world that Pokemon creates. And these games don't necessarily have to automatically expand to space, but when Pokemon made Pokemon Go, you really clearly saw how the world of the Pokemon manifested through a global game. And this kind of persistent world can jump between mediums because the qualities and traits and rules of the characters are specific to the world itself. And you can play this over a real world scenario. You could play it in an AR game. You could play it in a virtual reality game. There's tons of ways you can encounter this persistent world. Social expansions are absolutely something that we've seen happen during the COVID crisis. The picture that you're seeing here is an example of a gallery and a curator doing that in a very specific way. So you can leverage social networks and groups of people to create experiences. And this is the opening of Now Play This at Somerset House inside the game Animal Crossing New Horizons. And by showing up at the gallery at a specific point in time, at a specific website, or in a specific island in the game, you could all of a sudden take part of this opening. While only specific people who were speaking during the opening had access to the island where the event was taking place, everyone could watch their interactions on the streaming platform Twitch. And Now Play This is a small enough festival that the social graph around the festival itself has a very vibrant community. So the conversations were very sweet because the atmosphere itself was very trusting, and I thought it was one of the more delightful experiences I've seen. And I don't think that just because Animal Crossing has a social dimension that you would necessarily dial into that, but I feel like this curator using how this community is using Animal Crossing right now during the COVID crisis in the opening was a really, really nice moment of social expansion. Some more opportunities you can consider are our perceptions of space, local history and politics of a place, context of a situation, travel and timing, abandoned architecture in urban spaces, and social networks. So let's talk about those. You can discover and change people's perceptions, and you can blur and expose social norms, and you can transform the way that people understand space and recontextualize their behavior or architecture. Any object can be in and out of the game. Skateboarders and parkour people do this effortlessly. The act of skateboarding redefines the architecture into a play space, and the people suddenly become obstacles or collaborators or involved in the skate itself. And that's a really rich and beautiful experience. I saw a performance piece where dancers once fit themselves into small crevices in urban environments, and the act of contorting their bodies really made me rethink the architecture and how we moved through it and what we considered space that could be occupied. The local politics and history can be used as design tools, and Sacha Baron Cohen often does this to great impact in his series Who is America, which also has an element of dark play to it, which we'll discuss later on. But you can use the actual space and the social context to really raise people's awareness of issues and attitudes. And in this specific example, Sacha Baron Cohen gets a elected U.S. official to admit that he thinks children under 5 should know how to fire handguns. And they design this extremely terrifying handgun that a toddler should be able to use. You can play in prepared locations. And this is a really excellent piece by the artist Banksy. And this is a walled-off hotel in Bethlehem. And it sits on the border of Israel and the West Bank. And this wall is an incredibly politically charged wall. By taking a luxury hotel, or building a luxury hotel rather, in that context, you really immediately challenge a lot of assumptions of wealth and poverty, who's on which side of that wall, what the context is, what the surveillance state is. And he's doing a lot of that even in this one image, but I encourage you to go look at the full installation because it's absolutely worth your time. And these can be site specific or site adaptable. So you can play in a location that isn't as defined in this as this. So the game Punch Bug that you play as a child, where you punch your brother or sister if you see a VW if you're in the car, is a good example of this. So I would encourage you to think about location. Playing on the move is another way that you can make really interesting spatial provocations. And this is an example of one that happened this weekend. This is the arts festival called Amaze, and they did a VR meetup party dance experience extravaganza in Rec Room. And you had to wait for a specific time, and the code to the Rec Room was announced on Twitter, and then you could go into this dance room and have a good jump and say hey to your friends, which was a really lovely experience. I did it. I found it incredibly rewarding, especially now, to see my friends who normally I would have seen this weekend because it's right around the time a maze usually happens. And you can make people wait for specific times and places. And I sat there and waited for them to post it because I was excited about it. You can also play while moving. You can repurpose one form of moving into another. One of the things I used to do when I was in New York was try and not hold onto the rails of the MTA to pretend I was surfing. And that playfulness often caught people by surprise because I would often ride the MTA without holding on to anything, which is a little bit like riding the tube, a little bit crazy. But I loved it and I really enjoyed it. So you can also expand into urban environments. And one of the things you can do is explore abandoned spaces, such as trash heaps or forgotten locations like the Gowanus Canal in New York, or the tunnel that goes by the Brunel Center that goes under the Thames. These are forgotten environments. Some of them you can't even access anymore legally. This is an example of Ida Benedetto accessing one, I think, illegally. This is a water tower cooler in New York. And she distributed amongst her social network 12 keys, and a musical experience happened in this space at a specific point in time, but you could only get access to it if you had one of the keys and you knew when it was happening. And these keys traveled amongst the games community in New York, and they were extremely coveted while people were interested in playing the game and the game was running. Everyone wanted a key to the Night Heron because amazing bands were playing for 12 people inside a water tower. You know, those silver towers that were abandoned. And it was a really beautiful experience of a disused space that was reappropriated. And that's something you can think about. And she used social networks to pass hidden environmental clues like keys to a water tower. I heard that's what those things are called. So you can also expand into virtual space, and you have this kind of virtual layer, which we all know very well. But then there's a physical layer. So like the Amaze thing, you had to jump up and down, and I found myself breaking a sweat in my own living room, and it felt like all of a sudden the blurring between the virtual and the physical felt very much like I was in a nightclub in Berlin with my friends, particularly with the sound. And the augmented layer that you can put on top of reality is something that Nexus Studios office often deploys to great impact with a lot of their experiences. For example, the Childish Gambino concert, which had an entire AR layer. You can also play with people's social layers. So you can play with, social graphs, obviously Animal Crossing. And you can also play with people's inner experiences and what they're experiencing. And these layers are porous. You can move between them in really interesting ways. And I now wanted to talk about some properties to consider. And these can be considered across every, oh my goodness. All right. Dark poly should obviously be dark play, but I'll fix that later. So these properties, you can consider them across everything I've mentioned in all the spaces that I've talked about. And those properties are framing, semiotics, diegesis, and dark play. So you can subvert the frame to create structure. And what I mean by this is the play exists inside space embedded within other contexts, and you can leverage these multiple contexts and these multiple layers. So you can see the primary frame is the real world, and in the movie TV series Stranger Things, obviously the town the kids are living in, the school they're going to, this is the real world frame. And then there's a secondary frame, which is the player conversations about the game systems, the rules, how to play. This is a really good example of them playing D&D, and those conversations about that game leak throughout the entire film. And then the third frame Actually, yeah, because I mean, it depends. This last season, they talk a lot about how you move between the different levels of the game, and that becomes really important. And then there's the if you've not seen Stranger Things, I apologize for the metaphor, but then there's the tertiary frame, and that's the in-game world and the in-game conversations. And Stranger Things does a really beautiful thing of blurring across all these frames in ways that I find incredibly compelling, and I would love to see someone do this kind of thing in a game, because it's a really good use of narrative framing. So semiotics. Unaware participants, are they still players? This is a question, right? So there's a semiotic layer on everything that you see. And what that means is everything is either a signified object. You could see it as something that you're representing, like this drawing of a pencil represents a real pencil, for example. The real pencil would be the signified thing, but the signifier would be the icon of the pencil, for example. And this semiotic layer, the context of the symbols in the environment, can become really blurred. So you can have a signifier, which in the game means one thing, but in the real world means something totally different. And those two things can sit on top of each other in really interesting and fun ways. And you can play with what's called illusory attitudes. And these are unaware participants, and they're not going to limit their in-game actions according to any in-game rules. And that can create a really nice feeling of randomness. Diegesis is kind of what's in a game versus what's out of a game. And if you think about film, which is really famous for diegesis, film, if you're in a, lunatic asylum, I'm thinking of the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest film, and there's an announcement in the film that something's going on in, there's an escape or whatever. That's the narrator of the film telling you that there's been this event, right? But they're doing it within the diegesis of the story itself. And then another good example of a non-diegetic narrative experience is when Alfred Hitchcock just pops out and talks to you about his stuff in Alfred Hitchcock Presents. That's really clearly a non-diegetic narrator talking to you, the audience. And I've included a link to a video for more. So dark play is something that I think is really interesting because people don't know that they're playing, and you can really play with expectations. This is Improv Everywhere and a Walgreens in New York. And they turned what anyone who has any sense knows is an elevator on the 6 train into what they were calling an Apple store. And people lined up like in a big queue to get into this Apple store, which was actually just the 6 train. And you can emit this kind of meta-communication messaging, declaring someone non-ordinary, so they don't know they're playing. And you can use their ordinary expectations to engage play. So they see the big silver glass tower and the Apple icon. They think, oh, it's an Apple store. What's going on here? Must be a special event. People are in line. I'll get in line. What is this? And playing on expected environmental cues in unexpected ways. And this is a really good example. And Improv Everywhere is very famous in New York for doing this. I heavily encourage you to check their work out. In London, a really good example of this that happened recently was Blast Theory's Black Antler. Blast Theory is an interactive group here in the UK. And this is an interactive theater piece where you attempt to infiltrate an alt-right extremist group. And you go into a pub and you don't know if somebody's playing or not. So you start having these conversations and you start doing what you think you should do to get someone who's a fascist or a racist to think that you've got an acceptable attitude and get them to bring you into their level of, circle of trust. And it is a really uncomfortable thing because people actually ended up espousing a lot of views that they would normally never espouse. And they found that really discomforting and jarring. And it was an example of dark play, of crossing boundaries. And this was in response to the UK police who had infiltrated an environmental activist group. And in one case had lived for, I think, something insane, something really intense, like 18 years, and had gotten a woman pregnant and had a kid with her at one point, and then just vanished when the operation was over. So it's questioning that moral footing of who's right, who's wrong, how far can you go, what's acceptable policing, what's acceptable surveillance. Emergent play. And this is when play becomes emergent. We saw this in the work that we made together with Forest Daydream. On day one, the kids all got into what we, I think I started affectionately thinking of as the, lily pad game, where it's like they were leaping from cushion to cushion to cushion in a circle. And this game persisted throughout the whole day. And they were arranging the cushions in different orders and acting like the floor was lava. But on the second day, stacking became the behavior that all the kids decided to do. And this emergent property just persisted throughout the whole day as kids passed that form of play to each other through both telling them how to play and then watching other kids play. And when play becomes emergent like that, really magical stuff happens. And you as the designer don't control it, but you can encourage it through, things like putting big bouncy cushions on the floor and seeing what happens. You can also think about porousness. This is the thing you can do. You can lie. Dark play does this really well. You can bring the pleasure of the game into real life, and that is something that Improv Everywhere does a really good job of. You can take the thrill of the ordinary into the game, and an example of that would be, I think, if you have something that's normally really thrilling, like going to the top of the Shard or whatever. I mean, for me, the Shard's not exciting, but going to the top of the Empire State Building, very thrilling, super romantic, super exciting. And that, to me, would bring, if I played a game or wrote a game on top of that building, it would bring that atmosphere and that environment and the tourists and all the experiences of it into the game itself. And you can weave these things together to tell stories and create really interesting experiences. So originally, this whole kind of style of play was called perversive games or perversive playfulness. Perversive games is really the right term. But over this last several years, these genres have grown so much that I think that we can no longer talk about the idea of perversive, did I say perversive? Pervasive, please excuse me, pervasive games, because pervasive games almost were a genre. And now what's happened is this much deeper, much bigger cultural evolution. It's things like alternate reality become really common. Things like treasure hunts. Even Google now has treasure hunts on their like Google Earth map. Smart street sports like Run Zombie Run are very, very popular. Playful public performance like the Swings piece we saw in Montreal. Cities have those now, and they're much more accepted and they're much more common spread. Urban adventures are an entire genre in and of themselves. And there are also reality games, and the game Cam Over, if you want to look it up, is a really good example. This is a game where you destroy surveillance cameras, and the way the game system is created encourages that destruction. But I think now we've evolved beyond pervasive games to more of playful experiences and playful environments. And that's what I really want you all to explore within this class, because I think that framing this kind of thing is only possible in games really denies the fact that art has been doing this for many, 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 many decades at this point. I feel like Yoko Ono is a master of it with her work. And you see other artists like really think about this in interesting ways. Bill Viola is another artist who has really considered games and really made responses to those kinds of environments in his work. I encourage you to check out. Also, Oliver Eliasson is very clearly thinking about that in his work that was at SF MoMA. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this lecture and you get excited going into your final week your final project presentation prep, not final week. Thank the stars above. All right. Thanks for listening.